The role of the ITU on spectrum is to allocate the spectrum to the various services. You see, we speak about the broadband. Spectrum-wise, this is related to the spectrum used for providing broadband mobile services. And so the role of the ITU is to ensure that these services get the appropriate spectrum, but it's also to make sure that all of the services get appropriate spectrum. So there is a trade-off between the requirements of all services. Other services could be television broadcasting, it could be satellites, military services, transportation, Earth observation, etc. So there are so many services, and the role of the ITU is to make sure the spectrum required for each of them is secured. The other important role of the ITU is to make sure that this spectrum allocated is efficiently used. And therefore we have many study groups involved in elaborating the best practices and advancing the state of the art in terms of using spectrum efficiently and making recommendations for this purpose and standards as well. If you listen to the requirements, you can hear that people are talking that to the effect that in 2020 the spectrum required would be 500% more, or it's not the spectrum, but it's the bandwidth required, basically the capacity required in spectrum. And because of the trade-off necessary between the various services and the fact that spectrum is limited, it is unlikely that by that time you will have more than twice or even 3 times what we have currently allocated to mobile services. So this means most of the effort in using spectrum will have to come from efficiency and not from new allocations. So of course we'll make new allocations, but all the efforts will be in the networks to use the spectrum more efficiently. And this will require, of course, new investments. And this is one of the topics that is discussed in the Broadband Commission. You can see that the limitation is there today in 3G network. You can sense that it is relatively hard to get a high bit rate. So of course, as I said, it will take time for new network to be established, to use new technologies like more advanced antenna system on the base stations to basically increase the frequency efficiency. What is important to note is that spectrum although it is finite, there are some areas of spectrum which are more interesting. The lower frequencies are much more interesting to provide large coverage and therefore less costly deployment in sparsely populated areas. And therefore this is an important aspect if you want to reduce the digital divide. This is something that government need to realize when they are going to assign the new frequencies to new operators in the coming future. In that there are not so many opportunities to get access to these lower bands, and therefore the authorization need to be coupled with obligations in terms of coverage, so that the infrastructure available for broadband in the near future will be able to be deployed in a cost-effective way. The process of allocating spectrum in the ITU is done through World Radio conferences, which meet every 4 years. The next one is next January. The issue of allocating more spectrum is not on the agenda. What it will discuss is to include that on the agenda for the next conference. So you may worry that this is taking too long, but you have to consider that the spectrum which is going to be used for 4G, which is the 2.8 700 megahertz band and the 2.6 gigahertz band have been allocated respectively 4 years ago and 11 years ago. And they only start being used now. So it's a process that, as you can see, can easily take 10 years between the time new spectrum is allocated to the mobile and the time it is actually used. So I think when this new spectrum starts being used, you are going to see an improvement in the capacity proposed to the end users.